Thank you very much. Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to begin by thanking our two presidents, and above all, our Chancellor, who sits here and collates our thoughts and gives us advice. It's been invaluable. Thank you very much in advance. The purpose here, we are all scientists, and our purpose here is to discuss biological extinction in a wide range of contexts. And I thought I'd begin by thinking about the attitude that we as children inherited about the world around us in general and nature in particular. I cannot speak for the Christian tradition, and I hope sometime to this meeting our Chancellor could give us his interpretation of how our children are taught. But I do know a little bit about the Hindu tradition, and it's not so much a matter of stewardship. It's more that the nature itself has spiritual value. There are hymns sung to the morning. There are hymns sung to the evening, the stars. They go back to Vedic periods, and we've inherited, and it's a very living text, our attitude to nature. And yet, here we are. As scientists, we have realized, largely through interaction with people on the ground, at least I have learned a great deal of the errors of our ways from the speeches of villagers in India, because of course they see the effect of our actions rather immediately in terms of agricultural productivity, availability of water, and so forth. Now, one can take the attitude that we are where we are. I'm going to be taking it for granted that we understand that we are at a moment of crisis and have been accumulating for some time, that we are myopic. We don't care about the future. And that's a temptation, and there may be some truth in that too. But I'm not personally convinced that it's a very useful way as a social scientist to proceed, because in a sense you're answering the question before you've posed the problem. Parents care for their children, and they know their children will care for their children. By recursion, we do care about our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and so forth. It's a recursive study, and I find it in some ways questionable that we could presume that people do not care about their offspring. We do. So then where do we go wrong? And the place where we could look for is the inability to take reasoned collective action. We care about our descendants, our own descendants, but we may not care too much about others' descendants. And that clash may be an underlying reason as to why we are where we are. Responsible parenting involves, in addition to the wonderful words of Pope Francis, a recognition that we are part of the human enterprise and that our actions affect others and others' actions affect us. So it's a collective failure, and we see it, at least that's one way of thinking. And we see this collective failure, of course, readily when it comes to international negotiations. But if you go down the aggregate route to village councils, you see collective failure often there too. There's tons of anthropological literature which speak to the problems people face at every level, starting from the village starting from the household, through the village, to the locality, to state, to the nation, and then, of course, to the global order. We usually read about the global order, but these failures come down all the way down to the level of even the household. Our job here, as I see it, is to provide the scientific aspects of the extinction process. Many of the papers that have been submitted give the feeling, give the sense that we are to think of the biosphere, it just helps to think of the biosphere as a gigantic renewable natural resource. It might offend some sensibilities to think of it as a resource, but I'm assuming here that we are in agreement that occasionally we could think of it as a resource, and on the other hand, you could simultaneously look at not just as a means, but itself as a value of its own. Being renewable, we can interact with it, but if the demand exceeds its capacity to supply, then we are essentially drawing down the stock. That's one way of thinking about it. Of course, being gigantic, it means there's a huge aggregation issue. But we social scientists are used to aggregation, just as natural scientists are. We think of aggregating an entire economy. And all the bits and pieces, all the activities that are taking place, we somehow or the other try and aggregate them for our purposes. One purpose is to look at the aggregate activity of an economy, and we think, or economists have thought, and I've been fighting against it for quite some time, that the natural way of aggregation is to think in terms of the national product, the national income, GDP. That's an aggregation procedure. It hides in it the immense number of activities that are going on in various industries and aspects of life. The idea then is to penetrate that aggregation, and many of the papers are doing precisely that. We have papers on the oceans, on the landscape. At every level, we have to think of the processes that are churning out the services that we make use of, we humans make use of. Where does our hope lie? I don't think we're at a place, it is our task here to suggest policies. And one reason it is I shy away from doing that is that policies take a wide variety of forms. You could have very general policies like intervention of one kind or the other to reduce our consumption, but of course that doesn't really convey very much information. Policies are, in some sense, it is really rather important that policies be seen as evolving from the actors themselves. A policy in a village which has over-harvested its forests, the neighborhood forests, will look very different from the policies in a different context. One kind of policy that we often, at least we economists, pay very little attention to are norms of behavior, social norms. We think if you wake up an economist in the middle of the night and ask for policy, and he would think, or he or she is going to say something like taxation or regulation. But of course, enormous amount of our activities are guided by norms of behavior. It's not just in the South, in India or Africa, that norms, we are norm-guided people. We're norm-guided everywhere, even in Cambridge, especially in Cambridge. Norms are, and our preferences, the things that move us, are socially embedded. And that social embeddedness may well be a route forward. I do not know. I'm working a little bit in that direction. Some of my work has been, and I'm becoming more and more convinced, that the model that we economists have provided to the world. And when I say provided, we have won. That model rules our interpretation of the world, which is the consumer demand theory, that we come armed with preferences, and there is a marketplace there. We buy and sell, we make demands, and our entire conversation, starting from chancellors of the exchequer down to our neighbors, is prompted by that model. We have been a very successful profession, we economists, and yet it's fundamentally wrong. It's fundamentally wrong because we are not born with these preferences, and we don't even die with those preferences. Our attitudes are molded at every stage by our friends, neighbors, and what we read. That's what I meant by social embeddedness. And in some directions, we compete. Veblen, in his great work, talked about conspicuous consumption, being envious. I want to do better than the other. And of course, that has a ripple dynamic effect, which could bring some sense to the overconsumption that we are experiencing at the moment. I am using overconsumption as a flip side to the extinction problem. Okay. But at the same time, we also are conformist. We like to be like others. In so many of our, at Cambridge, one of our social activities is to dine with our friends, invite colleagues, friends to dinner. It would be unthinkable to show off. You do not try and beat your neighbor on the quality of the wine you serve. You may. It's really very, very implicit understanding of the kind of food we serve, the rituals that we work through, sherry perhaps. It used to be sherry before dinner, but no longer. It's more wine. And observing these and reflecting on them, I think, is useful because it's there, maybe, that our salvation lies, that our recognition that we are in a deep process of collective failure, and that we overlook that our daily activities are perhaps sending us a guidance of how we should think about the wider world through the political arena. The Academy of Social Science has been extremely active over the past 2 decades in thinking about social embeddedness of preferences. This has been a very important work which hasn't yet influenced our economists, but I'm working at it. One has to be patient. Unfortunately, time is really rather limited. The pace of activity since the end of the Second World War has been enormous. In the paper that Paul Ehrlich and I've are presenting here, the second half of the paper looks at perhaps the reasons why the natural scientists are regarding the end of the Second World War as perhaps being the beginnings of when the humanity entered the Anthropocene and the great extinction that we're experiencing. So that's our task, to try and articulate the extinction process. And hopefully that will give us guidance. And some of us social scientists in some of the papers have addressed bits and pieces of it, to think as to how to present this to the world at large. I cannot help thinking, as a final remark, this is something that the papers haven't touched on, but it's something for us to think about. When we think of policy, we think of, as I say, norms of behavior or taxes and subsidies and regulations. But there is one kind of policy which I feel it would be wonderful for us to promote, and that is education. And by education, I mean the education that we are providing to one another at this conference. We are sharing knowledge. And we are very privileged. We're so privileged that I sometimes cannot believe how privileged I am in the sense of being, that top 0.001% of the world's population, not in terms of income, but in terms of the things that matter, to me anyway, which is the ability the privilege of being able to think about the problems that matter. We are becoming more and more urbanized, and I cannot help but think that our children and our grandchildren have very little understanding of the world around us, the natural world around us. And I'd like to think that perhaps one route that we could explore, the academies could explore, over matters of extinction, is to try and influence the educational system. In England, the tasks are the triple R, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Absolutely right, too. Those are the crucial. But there could be a fourth, which is it's a kind of education which goes all along, from the earliest stage to make sense of the world we see as we go for our walks in the park or in the city. We see the birds, the kind of things that Professor Arbour was identified. We really need to know this web of connections. At our age, we have some glimpse of it, but that's because we have the privilege of being scientists and being paid to understand. But I can't help feeling that until people feel deeply the loss that we would be suffering from, until that happens, until it hits you in the gut, we will not make the kind of progress that we ought to. Thank you very much.